So today we're going to look at the chapter from Gerald Bruns, Hermeneutics, Ancient and Modern, on the radical turn in hermeneutics. That's the title of the chapter, chapter 11 of that book, up on the screen behind me. And what Bruns there does is try and bring us into a discussion about the nature of hermeneutics, and starts to acquaint us with a new stream of thinking about hermeneutics, and specifically a radical turn in it, which is located, if we're going to talk about an individual, is located in the philosophy of Martin Heidegger. That's when the radical turn takes place. And I'm going to recapitulate this ground more than once, so if you find it confusing the first time, I think for the next few weeks, we'll be talking about Saussure and his structuralism form of linguistics, and they're looking at it in terms of the way that dynamic is supposed to play out. And then we'll go back to Eagleton and look at how he presents the development of Heideggerian linguistics effectively as well, because I don't think that's Saussure and Heidegger are not the same or anything like the same, but I think they're both in the tradition of that leads to postmodernism for different reasons, from different angles, but they have a common outcome in a sense, which is cognitive relativism. Now, cognitive relativism basically just asserts that truth is relative. Now, we know that in other forms, usually, that is relativism, often in terms of epistemological relativism. So in Canada now, there are Indian forms of knowing, or cultural forms of knowing. So 2 + 2 = 4 is asserted to be white math, right? So this is just the adjective there is suggesting that it is dependent on something other than the mere cognitive act of appropriating truth. It's been problematized somehow. And that problematization is the result of, I think, Heidegger's turn towards being as opposed to understanding. But Bruns here is going to situate us within that context, and I'm going to, as throughout, I'm going to disagree, or rather present a different take than I am finding in the critics, and I'm going to refer you back to what I said last semester when I talked about the development in the early 18th century of a theory for how language develops, which I think is key, and it is usually ignored in these discussions, but I think it's absolutely pivotal. And I'll just recapitulate a little bit, and then I'll connect with Bruns here, and then hopefully we can go forward. So just to recapitulate, whether you want to look at Rousseau or that German philosopher by the name of Herder, in both cases, they posit an origin to language because basically both men are interested in the scientific age for grounding the humanities in an empirical fashion, the same way that the natural sciences had done. Remember, the natural sciences used a certain methodology of obtaining knowledge through trial and error, through experience. The scientific method, as we're taught in high schools to this day. And the objectivity of that knowledge was made on the basis of repeatable experiments. Given the certain conditions, and the conditions were very much limited And if you couldn't limit the outside influences on the experiment, then your experiment was not valid. You had to remove anything that might change the outcome. But if you have those same conditions in place, then you can study, let's say, a chemical reaction in a test tube. And with all of those things, if you can repeat that elsewhere, then that is the way things are. But you do it on the basis of study, on the basis of an empiricist study of the objects. And that is the foundation of the experimental method. Now, in the humanities, they sought to do the same thing with respect to language. And as I said at the time, to deracinate it, so to uproot it from the tradition that had been established of understanding language as in theological terms. And what are the theological terms? Well, that God reveals himself in the Word, in revelation. He discloses his truth. He is the Word. He uses words. The words of Scripture point to the Word of God himself, and his revelation grounds our understanding of all other texts, including the text of nature, what we call nature, the visible, objective, empirical order that the scientists themselves are studying. Now, the scientists are using that experimental method also take language then as an object of knowledge and simply try to use the empirical method to understand it. Right? So they take language, the very thing that they're using to discuss the object, as the subject of investigation. And with that, they don't want to connect everything to God. In a sense, they're following the Cartesian path of beginning with extraordinary skepticism and only going to verify as true the things that they can't doubt. And they can doubt that God revealed all things. And they want to make the ground of certitude on individual human experience, just like Descartes did. Remember, Descartes used the method of doubt. Dubito ergo sum. I doubt. No, actually, I doubt, therefore I'm thinking, and I'm thinking, therefore I am. And that's the sort of scorched earth policy that Descartes uses. Well, they do the same thing here with respect to language. We're not going to take language as something that is an attribute of human nature, and uniquely so. Animals don't have articulated sound that is pointing to a rationally observable good world that we can understand. Why can we understand it? Because we're made in the image of God and have the capacity to name things and articulate them in a truthful fashion. They're going to dismiss all that. And what are they then going to understand as language? Language is, in its earliest origins, and this is both Herder and Rousseau, they'll say that human language began in grunts and cries. And it began in grunts and cries as emotional expression, which is the way that when we articulate our sounds, when we're emotional, we don't tend to do so in a rational. We go, oh, or oops, or ouch. So they're monosyllabic and often intensely expressive formulations of words. And they're often very similar in multiple languages, which is interesting. Tend to be high-pitched as well, not just low-pitched. They're high-pitched. The high pitch expresses certain things as well. That's how language began, says both Herder and Rousseau. And so it's an emotional thing. And emotion is very close to language in its origins then, which is the very reason that they suggest that poetry is the age that precedes the age of science. And so if you want to get to the essence of things, then you want to get to the form of language that is closest to our human nature in its most fundamental ways, and that's through the language of the emotions. And poetry then, by that standard, is strongly associated with emotion. which is a very sharp deviation from any poetic understanding from the classical era. And it doesn't matter who you're talking about there. It's just a very sharp. It's not even a digression. It's a contradiction of anything that had been said before, whether it's biblical or even the pagan writers. They are not going to understand things, language as an emotional expression, fundamentally. But Wordsworth adheres to this when he says that all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. So that's a sort of a romantic take. And often we will associate Herder and Rousseau with Romanticism for good reason, because both of them see the importance of feeling as the sort of basic human form of understanding. Even is to feel it, to express it. But I said to you that even in this period, when, although this is agreed upon, the origin is in this, when it comes to how does language then evolve from that, how does it develop from that, there's a difference between the camps there on how it develops. One of them is to say that that noise that I make, ouch, is rooted in a thought, a thinking about the thought. It's thinking about thought. And the other is thinking about the sound or the feeling. And and that dispute there in the early 18th century starts to create a gulf. It's two paths. And that's what our man Bruns here is talking about. There are two paths of hermeneutics. One that believes that we can understand clearly, universally, through reasoning. What language is a sort of form of cognition about cognition, without problems. Now that path is the direction that the philosophers tend to follow, at least early days. So Immanuel Kant, in his Critique of Pure Reason, thinks that we can universally think about certain things and without any particular problem. And his only concern is that we eradicate prejudice from our discussions. And as one of the hermeneutic philosophers, Gadamer, is going to say, Kant has a prejudice against prejudice. We tend to fall with the academy tends to be Kantian in many ways. It sees its goodness in eradicating prejudice and with the aim of having a more inclusive, universal form of knowledge. What's true of everyone in every place will be that form of knowledge that eliminates difference as a consideration. And although I said that Wordsworth is, in a sense, very much strongly related to Herder and Rousseau insofar as he lauds feeling as the most basic and most important aspect of human nature, nonetheless, we note that just like Kant, he assumes a universality about human feeling. All human beings feel the same things, and they always have done. There's no differences between them. So when I start talking about Rousseau, or Wordsworth rather, when I teach romantics, people say, oh, he's a relativist, because he points to feeling regularly as the solution to all human ills, is to understand that we all feel things, and we should go back to that feeling in the presence of nature. And nature then has a certain function in Wordsworth's thought there. And they say, well, but this is the beginning of relativism. And I say, but it's not for Wordsworth. He sees universality about feeling. And so the digression, the parting of ways is not yet apparent. It becomes apparent over the course of time. It takes a century and a half, 2 centuries before it really, the problem of the original attempt to understand language through a solely human, objective, scientific, experimental view of language. Let's stand at it from the outside, look at it objectively as scientists, and pretend it isn't what tradition has said it is, which is just a gift that man has, the animals don't. And Christians will add further, it's because we bear the image of God. But Plato, Aristotle, any philosopher you name will be very happy to say that language differentiates man from the beasts. And furthermore, that our language is reasonable, it's rational. The Greeks are very strong on this, and the whole tradition for that matter. So when we use the logos, we're also using logic, and the laws of logic apply to our use of language. That doesn't hold, however, if we think that language itself is rooted in feeling. And so you will hear, and I think this is a mistake, but you will hear in contemporary oversimplifications of this whole discussion, which I have sympathy towards, because you do need to do this when you teach. You try and provide sort of footholds on which to think about the whole subject. They'll say that the Enlightenment focuses on reason and Romanticism focuses on feeling, and we get a conflict between the two. And this is played out in pop culture in, say, like Star Trek, where Mr. Spock is the rationalist who wants to get rid of feeling, not talk about it at all, as the basis for a good counsel. And then you have others like Counselor Troy in the Next Generation, who talks about what other people are feeling in this situation. Well, I think so. It's two different approaches. And in pop psychology, there was a book out, I don't even know when it was out, but Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. So you get the men as the warrior, rational, detached, and the women as the empathetic, loving characters, and you get this dichotomy set up between the two sexes, which is, I think, addressed by C.S. Lewis in certain ways in his sci-fi trilogy, which is interesting, although he's not falling for the pop psychology. But the pop psychology is articulating an understanding of 18th century debates, is what I'm saying. And that by this point, they've become more or less entrenched in the academy. And you go in one of two directions. Either you think that feeling is the most human thing, and we gravitate towards that, or you gravitate towards rationalism. And there's nothing in between. And there's no solution to this discussion at that point either. Either we're marked by rationalism or irrationalism, because our feelings are not rational. If everything is rooted in feelings, ultimately so. But the rationalists, which we've looked at thus far, are very happy to use to study language as a phenomenological thing. So it's something that we observe as human beings, not an aspect of human nature. And the result of that is that they eventually jettison any notion of human nature. We'll come to that towards the end of the course. They will get rid of all ideas that human nature is fundamentally different from the animals, for instance, because what do we have in common with the animals, or what distinguishes us? Well, at root, nothing, because we feel just like the animals feel, and like the plants feel, for that matter. Because plants are also sensitive to light and sound and distress and environmental concerns and so forth. So the commonality between us and the created order is rooted in feeling, and this is more basic than language. Language is something that comes after, and in a sense is unnatural. Makes sense, right? So thus far, as I say, the path of the humanities is pushing in the direction of pure reason, following Kant, throws theology out of the university, and will explore through the Geisteswissenschaften, the human sciences, the social sciences, a view of language as a culturally constructed thing. Because how do we get from feeling to words? Well, the words come from social agreement. Like, how do I know that green is the word for the color green? In other languages, French is vert. It's a different word altogether. And so this is the explanation for how the different languages develop, is that it's just a social agreement. Well, in this area of the world, they agree on the color green. Yes, that green is not that color. So what are we going to call that? We're going to call it green or vert or whatever. And that's how words then develop. So it's through social conventions. And so because of social conventions, the words never have the authority of truth. Just social agreement. So truth becomes culturally relative, because words are just the repositories of truth, but they're not the actual representations of truth. Or if they are the representation of truth, then they're just culturally relative. And we're going to see that in Saussure's structural linguistics. He is going to give a methodology for this same sort of understanding of how language develops. But note that this is an 18th century thought experiment that is played out in continental philosophy. And the one branch leads us to Kant. Now, I'm going to read this extract from Bruns, and he will connect us to this. But this is important. So the one direction leads to word social agreement, but the philosophers are going to call these social agreements as pure reason, and the conditions of pure reason. But note that the conditions of pure reason still refer back to the social agreement, the social contract of Rousseau and others. It's not that the words refer to a thing, the res and the signa. So the words are the signa, but they never point to the res, they just point to other signa, other signifiers, which are socially agreed, but they don't actually point to a thing. It gets caught up in a serious problem, in fact. But so this is his summary here. Hermeneutics belongs to multiple histories, and so cannot be made into one thing that begins and ends and suffers conceptual revolutions along the way. Although in our effort to make sense of hermeneutics, this is very much the sort of story we are apt to be looking for and inevitably come to rely on. Thus, in the second part of Truth and Method, which I have not had you read and I'm not going to have you read, but which I read as a PhD student, spent significant time on this, and Heidegger and so forth, because it was half my thesis was in the history of hermeneutics. And because I was troubled by how the notion of hermeneutics, as it develops from the Romantics onwards, deviates from what I would understand as the traditional understanding of interpretation. Not just as a Christian, but just even as a thinker. How do they go so far away from Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas, let alone a sort of a biblical understanding per se, which I think fits with that tradition? How did this come to pass? So I figure this out. So I read Truth and Method, so let me stop talking about my own journey here. But thus, in the second part of Truth and Method, Gadamer sketches out a history of hermeneutics that begins with the romantic idealism of Hegel, Schleiermacher, and Dilthey. Yes, it begins with this period. It doesn't begin with what comes before it. So it's as if the study of interpretation only began in the 18th century. And in a sense it does. And this is why I like to use the word that they use as a differentiation. Up to this point in Christian thought, and I'm going to erase this now, we have interpretation, and they use the Latin word interpretatio. But from this period onward, there's a new science which is of interpretation, but it's called hermeneutics. And this is the fancy word. It's not particularly fancy, but it's the word that is unusual because there is no verb in English to hermeneutic a passage, but we can say to interpret a passage. We understand what is meant by that. And we often think that they're dealing with the same thing, and they are dealing with the same thing, insofar as both are doing a sort of interpretation. But hermeneutics is predicated on the validity of the Romantic enterprise begun by Rousseau and Herder. It's predicated upon that. It doesn't even consider what comes before that. That's not true of Bruns. But when Bruns comes to look at the past, I often think that he doesn't entirely grasp the clear divide between what goes before and what comes after. In fact, he suggests a commonality, hermeneutics, ancient and modern. And I beg to disagree. I think this is a fundamental mistake. I think there is a significant gulf there, and it is rooted in the early 18th century, in the attempt to study language scientifically, to create a human sciences divorced from theology, divorced from truth. And the reason he doesn't see it is because the philosophers like Kant and Hegel and Schleiermacher and Dilthey are in the rationalist tradition, the so-called rationalist tradition. They use the language of trying to recover truth, and they assume that this is possible. But they only do it by means of, and this is important, Immanuel Kant's Copernican turn. Remember, he talks about this in the Critique of Pure Reason. And he suggests that and he's making an analogy on the basis of what happened in the area of astronomy. That just as Copernicus proposed that rather than the whole cosmos revolving around the Earth, it revolves around the sun as a Copernican turn, so Copernicus totally transforms. In the same way, rather than looking at the objective material world as the thing that our thoughts need to conform to, let's flip it around and say that the objects have to conform to our capacity to understand them. So he turns it inwards. The whole project is turned inwards. So the object being studied is the mind, not the world. The mind is the chief subject of study. And in this sense, I think Kant gives the foundation for the Geisteswissenschaften. Right there. It's not his phrase. But as soon as you make the mind the object of real study, then you make psychology the key discipline. And then psychology is played out sociologically, anthropologically, etc. But it's all about psychology, and psychology is all about feelings. Right? The study of your feelings. But it's understood still at this point to be a rational pursuit with universally valid objects, because it's following the methodology of the natural sciences here. So thus in the second part, Gadamer sketches out a history of hermeneutics that begins with the Romantic idealism of Hegel, Schleiermacher, and Dilthey, where hermeneutics is defined in terms of a consciousness whose objects are the products of an expressive spirit, just what I just said, and whose task is to reconstruct this originating spirit in order to clarify and participate in, or to appropriate and go beyond its self-understanding. So that's what understanding is. Understanding is living in the experience of somebody who is other than us, particularly somebody in the past. We want to walk in their shoes. And Schleiermacher is so optimistic about that, he thinks that we can know as well, if not better, than the original authors what they meant when they wrote. That's how optimistic he is. But it's our job to understand it from their perspective, but we can actually make progress on it. And Hegel will present a whole scaffolding to present the phenomenology of spirit. Note the language. The physical, observable expression, phenomenology, how it appears, of spirit which we can't see. And so mind becomes expressed, and that's what language is, an expression of mind and being and so forth. Jordan Peterson falls into this camp again. but so do all psychologists. They simply presuppose that the beginning of this study is in the 18th century, and then they apply this methodology anachronistically to the past and say that it's all about interpretation, and hermeneutics is interpretation. And I say, no, it is not, because it has a wholly different presupposition. And it assumes that feeling is the most basic aspect of human nature, and it does so by analogy, because it says, well, when we're born, we can't speak, but we have feelings. And then we develop language over the course of time as we mature, and they say that that analogy applies to society, more or less. So again, it's a little bit of the microcosm, macrocosm. But let's look at the turn here. But with Heidegger, so that point we've looked at intensely, and I've problematized it and said that it leads to postmodernism, which it does. However, it's not expressed as postmodernism. It's not even realized as such. And even amongst Hegel, Schleiermacher, and Dilthey, they don't see this as the roots of postmodernism, because, again, they think that it's about the mind and the development of the mind over the course of time. And the mind is universal in its conclusions. Kant, the whole German tradition assumes that it will have universality about it. They don't see the problem of relativism. They simply don't see it, because they're wedded to their methodology, and they pursue it very rigorously, very impressively. But with Heidegger, another German writer now we're talking, and I'll say more about Heidegger later when we talk more about Heidegger in subsequent classes, and we'll just skip over the story of Heidegger. But Heidegger is writing in the 20th century, and in the backdrop of Nazi Germany, for that matter. And I won't get into that discussion right now either. But with Heidegger, as the story goes, this history splits in two. And I agree with this here. This is correct. With Heidegger, there's a decisive shift that probably brings to the surface something that is latent. In fact, that's my argument. It's latent in the whole project from the beginning, that there's something that is not amenable to reason. And it was there from the beginning, and it simply observes it. And what does he say? There are those who continue Dilthey's Kant-like concern with how knowledge of historical and cultural products is possible. Yes, there are those that continue to do that. Husserl's phenomenology, with its transcendentalist conceptions of meaning and consciousness, is regarded by many as a way of determining the logical conditions of Verstehen. Verstehen is the German word for understanding. And understanding is, unlike Vernunft, and now I'm using Kantian terms, he talks about Vernunft, this is reason. This is how it's translated in English anyway, whereas Verstehen is understanding. And understanding is predicated on empirical objects, whereas reason is pure. And they work hand in glove, but still. But this is what are the logical conditions of Verstehen? Well, the logical conditions are found in reason. But it's about finding the conditions of conditions and so forth. It's always this recovery of that original romantic moment going back to feeling. At any rate, but those who follow Heidegger, different path, understand that consciousness is never alone with its objects, but is always situated, always historical, and contingent, so that it is no longer enough to think of understanding as an activity of consciousness at all. This is the problem. The whole project of Kant, Schleiermacher, Hegel, Dilthey, it has the problem of being in the world. We're always already conditioned by the limitations of being in the world. It's not just a matter of pure reason. That's impossible. It's an idol. It's absurd. Here, the other, that is the other person or something that is not us. That's what, and now this word, the other, is used in postmodernism all the time, the other. And the other will refer in feminist to men and vice versa. So men refer to anything that's not male as the other, and females are others, and they just don't understand women, etc., all that. You'll get the same thing for post-colonialism. You'll same thing in queer studies. They'll talk about the other and othering, and imposing a certain grid of understanding on other things as if there were universal ways of concluding. And those who are going to adopt the postmodern hermeneutics will say, you don't understand the other. And you're assuming that reason applies universally. But it does not, because there are alternative ways of knowing. And go back to what I said, there's a native way of knowing. You don't think that this is real? Look at what the University of McGill is doing right now. And other universities in Canada. They are talking about other ways of knowing that are radically at odds with Western reasoning. But the other, here, the other, and you almost put it in scare quotes because it's a funny use of language, but the other is what is not the self. There's the self and there's the other. The other always constitutes the limit of understanding as such. So I can't know what's in your mind. I can't recover it the way the Romantics think, that I can know as well, if not better, than what you're thinking. There's a barrier there because I'm not you. The Romantics always assume that the self is a universal quality, not the person, but the self and self-understanding. Following Descartes, I think, therefore I am. The I that thinks is not the same I. They problematize human nature, in other words. It's not just pure reason. And the other can never be objectified. Goes against the whole Geisteswissenschaften tradition here. It can never be objectified. It can never be appropriated once and for all in any finite interpretation. So for Gadamer, it is this excessiveness of the other, this finitude or situatedness of understanding that calls for reflection. So these are the conditions of prejudice. And they will be in terms of body, nation, language, sexual orientation, gender, and you name it. All the things that are prohibited grounds for discrimination, they will multiply, and they will become actually infinitely multiplied when we get to gender identity, because at that point, gender itself has no objective verification whatsoever. It's self-identification. If somebody self-identifies as this, you have to accept it because there's no objective means of verifying anybody's self. So this is following a certain path of thinking. You're wondering where these contemporary expressions come from. Jordan Peterson calls them relativism. It is a form of relativism. Absolutely. No doubt about it. But we're here not trying to just to name it. We're trying to see where it comes from and how it develops and how to think about this. But the result of this is that, and this is interesting, historicality, not history, or historical transmission, is the true object, the Sache of hermeneutics. Now the Sache is the race. Let me translate from English to German to Greek. Actually, Latin. Sache is race. It's the thing. So historicality, what does we mean by historic? So you have to invent new words in English to follow this, right? Historicality. Not history or historical transmission, but historicality. So the conditions of being in history, that becomes the study of hermeneutics. From Heidegger onwards. It's the being of being. Not being in the capital B universal sense of Kant and that tradition, and certainly not the being intended by Aquinas when he grounds being as the the basic understanding of God in his great work of theology. Right? Aquinas will say that being is the nature of God, the beingness of being. But when Aquinas says this, he doesn't mean what Heidegger means by this. They both appeal to being as the ultimate category, but they don't mean the same thing by being, because one is a situatedness, a finitude, as the study here. And so this is called by Bruns as a radical turn, and I think it is a radical turn. But the radical turn, radix is root in Latin, the radical turn is actually going back to the early 18th century and plotting a different path, not pure reason, but to a sense, pure irrationality, if you will. Now, if that makes any sense. Does it? I don't know. It's as sensible as I can make it. Now, one problem with Gadamer's history of hermeneutics is that it leads up to and stops with Truth and Method in 1960. It is true because postmodern literary theories start to blossom in the late 60s, but that's not what he's talking about, in which he explicates the notion of historicality initially in terms of authority and tradition. Now, come post-1968, we're not going to appeal to authority and tradition at all. But he does this before that departure. And taken in their customary senses, authority and traditions seem notoriously to blame whenever historicality is denied or repressed. If we imagine that this is all Gadamer is saying, then that historicality is simply the uncritical perpetuation of authority and tradition, then more radical accounts of historicality are certainly both possible and desirable. Now, he's going to go here and talk about Caputo. John Caputo, whom I've never mentioned here, and I'm not going to follow Caputo. He's interested in Caputo more than I am, or I'm more knowledgeable of it. I will prefer to look at Jacques Derrida, who we will look at briefly in a class to come, and what we will call deconstruction. And he seems to think that, to Bruns that is, seems to think that Gadamer can be held on to without the deconstructive outcome of Caputo and Derrida. So he's going to try and give an apologetic for Gadamer's approach. And we'll get to that. And I think it's interesting. But his history is Caputo's, is a history of hermeneutics that bypasses Gadamer and the Romantics almost completely. His history is an end of philosophy story about the way deconstruction shakes us loose from our categories and exposes us to the original difficulty of life. The original difficulty of life. What is hermeneutical about deconstruction is precisely its concern with concrete situations in which meaning is constituted, and what is radical about it is that it is not just a critical reflection on these situations, but an intervention in them. Deconstruction is an exercise in disruption which displaces whatever tends to settle in place. And in that sense, it's part of the Enlightenment project and a continuation of it. It's to say that there is no certitude that we can hold to as the Sache, because the Sache, the thing unto itself, is never attainable by human beings. It's just a new form of expression of truth, but it's contingent and relative and dependent on time and place, and we need to come up with new ones. And so the deconstructionists like Derrida and postmodernists in general are always going to want to revise what words mean and how we ought to live in this world. It's infinitely revisable, and it ought to be infinitely revisable, because all of our terms of truth are always contingent and dependent on historicality. So that was true in the 1960s, that we believed in the Enlightenment and the project that Jordan Peterson talks about, and the goodness of one man, one woman marriage, and the idea, the definition of the family and those sorts of things. Yes, but family can now mean something different. In Ontario family law, they got rid of the word father and mother in the law, and they replaced it with parent. And you could have up to 4 of those. because it's constructive, as a parent is just somebody in authority, and not actually, as the word parent suggests, somebody that bears the child. It can be another couple. You can have up to 4 parents, and you can pull one out and put another one back in, by the way. And I don't even know why they have 4 parents. I don't know why if it's not 100. It's because I think it sounds really crazy if it goes beyond a certain number, and so we want to limit it. Oh, okay, we'll have 4 parents. I don't know why 4. 4 seems arbitrary. Some of them will challenge it in court, and they'll strike that down. It won't be 4 anymore. It can be an agreeable number to the party concerned. It's all up for negotiation, because everything that we determine is up for negotiation in this language game. And now, here's the other thing about Heidegger, and I'm going to say more about this when we look at Heidegger. Heidegger says that language is the house of being. This is an interesting phrase. Language is the house of being. So it's where being lives. And so we can't understand being without language. So there's a turn towards language and importance of language. And this is why we note in our day what we never note in ages past is a strong desire in the academy to control language and speech. Political correctness is a consequence of the idea that language is the house of being. It's not just that it's relativistic, it's, in other words, the outcome of this, it is combines total anarchy, which is the result of cognitive relativism, with its exact opposite, tyranny, because they have to control the outcomes of their own methodology. To break everything down to make it socially constructed leads to nobody agreeing on anything. So how do we address that? Well, we get the government to come in, representing the people, to determine what you can say and what you can't say. It's to control the outcome of their own presuppositions, which are false, I say. That's maybe too loaded, but I can put my cards on the table here. But you could say it's at least a thought experiment that began in the early 18th century, which has now failed, which is what I argued in my book, Romanticism, Hermeneutics, and the Crisis of the Human Sciences. What's the crisis? It keeps going back to the original point and trying to redefine the self, and yet it finds that the self that it as object is trying to define is the self that's also the subject. So the subject and the object are the same, but they act as if they're different things, and they keep on, like you, when you have the sun behind you and you try and jump on your head, the shadow moves along with you. So Kant's prejudice against prejudice was never possible, but it's not because of Kant's failure, it's because of the failure of the whole project from the beginning, which is to understand language in terms of feeling. There's the problem. A self-created problem by man trying to understand man as God. And then Hegel will say that that the state is the voice of God. Vox populi, vox Deo. The voice of the people is the voice of God. And what's the voice of the people? Whatever the people decide words mean. And so the academy, having rid itself of Christian theology, comes up with a new theology, and the theology is the theology of the spirit of the people, which is a culturally constructive and relative and always evolving, transforming thing. Right? That famous phrase, and this is from Hegel. Okay, throw that one away. Vox populi, vox Dei. The voice of the people is the voice of God. So, critiquing the previous. So this is the Heideggerian problematizing of universalizing reasoning of Hegel and Kant and diltai and so forth. The idea of understanding the other as well as it understands itself looks back to a moment of self-presence that it is the task of hermeneutics to represent in certain regions of discourse, geometry, say, or the region of the assertion. This task seems easy. People are asserting things. Okay, well, that's assertion. I can understand. An assertion is assertion. I don't have to say that it's true. It's just an assertion. Geometry is true, same way. Can't be doubted. Geometry works. Univocal meanings seem to make possible what Derrida calls pure traditionality, in contrast to expressions of genius, which are frequently not translatable. In either case, however, the task is the same: to recover the original moment of expression, live through it once more, restore its animating spirit to the life of immediate experience. So this is the idea of nach erleben, after living, reliving, after the fact. We can feel what the Apostle Paul felt when he wrote these words. Re-experiencing the lived experience of another is the romantic theory of hermeneutical experience. Yes, it is. And it's the theory of poetics, according to romantics as well. You're expressing yourself. Which, if that is the criteria of good poetry, it says that anybody who writes a poem writes an equally valid poem, because there are no objective criteria. I just need to feel what you're feeling. And kids are taught this in school, for which reason they hate literature. Absolutely hate it, because it's a form of intellectual abuse. I want you to do this project, and I'm going to grade you on something that actually has no intrinsic merit at all, or extrinsic merit. There's no merit. You're expressing yourself. Okay, but why do I want to do that? Well, because I'm telling you to do it. Why are you telling me to do that? Because it's good for you, it's who you are, but I don't want to do that. Doesn't matter. So when I was in school, I had to do a journal daily to get us writing, because I guess writing was good. But the teacher said that she would not mark it. She would just see that we'd done it. So I had a friend who wrote out pop songs every day, and I wrote out encyclopedia entries, and we got check mark for it. So I think, I'm not going to, so you're making me go through this, jump through these hoops. And of course it makes children really cynical. Of course. So in other words, learning is doing what I'm told, which is good for me for a reason you can't articulate. And there is no good writing or bad writing. It's just be writing, because writing is good. But then it just begs the question of why writing would be good anyway. But never mind. But that's the theory of pure traditionality. But there's a different way of seeing this. And this is the path that Caputo and Derrida will go down, which is the idea of hermeneutics, going back to that word hermeneutics, which I've now removed, and the figure that is at the center of hermeneutics, namely the ancient Greek god Hermes. Hermes is the messenger of the gods, as everyone knows. And Derrida refers to the postal principle as the way in which the romantics understand things. I write something and you get the message and you know exactly what I'm saying. It's really easy. Understanding is not a difficult thing. I speak, you understand. That is what Derrida calls the postal principle. So the postal principle is the principle of message bearing, and hence the principle of all hermeneutics. Hermes, as the message bearer from the gods, is the first of all postmen. I mean, Derrida's making light of it. And it is to Hermes that the later Heidegger attaches the only possible sense that hermeneutics can have. Only a god can save us now, he said. That is, only a dispatch carried by Hermes. Why? Because the message is not clear. It's garbled. The message gets confusing. It's like what do you call that when you're whispering to somebody's ear and it goes down the line? Broken telephone. we need a God to come in to tell us what the original message was, because the garbling that went all along the way through the interpretations from the situatednesses of being that varied between people and ages and times and sexes and identities and all that, garbled it so badly that we actually can't. Now he's overstating the case, but he's showing the problem with message bearing. Now it is just such an epistolary service that Derrida wants to show is always already confounded and thrown into disarray. Letters are lost, messages garble, and neither the proper senders nor the proper addressee can be identified. If the history of the West is the collected and collective Gehistory, it's Geschichte, it's the German word for history, of beings' sendings, Schickungen, or Geschicke, from the verb schicken, to send or mail, the confounding of the postal service is likewise a confounding of being's own delivery service. Now this is from Caputo's Radical Hermeneutics. Oh, I can't even open this. I used to open it and the cold air would blow in, and then they took away the little device that I used to do this to thwart me. So the room is going to be controlled from, never mind, because we're all happier that way. Anyway, don't let me get off track on this. Now the reference here, and here's interesting, is to Heidegger's dialogue on language, Unterwegs zur Sprache, underway to language, in which Heidegger, as a way of getting beyond hermeneutics, that is the hermeneutics of Kant, Hegel, Dilthey, everyone up to his age, doesn't problematize it, gives an allegorical interpretation of Hermes. Now Heidegger is a very inventive writer. He wants to think outside the box, and he sees rationalism as a sort of a box. And it is a box. And it's a box that thinks it's universal, but it actually isn't universal. It's got the prejudice against prejudice. There's problems with that. Well, it has the problem of dealing with prejudice. And prejudice is here reconceived, not as a negative thing, but as a necessary aspect of being in the world. We are prejudiced just by being limited. We can't be this and that at the same time. I am not you. Right? There's something different. There's something in common, but there's something very different. He emphasizes the difference rather than the commonality. Hermeneutics is message bearing, but message bearing is always referring back to the sender. Just as Dilthey's notion of experience, Heidegger says, always means to refer back, to refer life and lived experience back to the I. Experience is the name for the referral of the objective back to the subject. The celebrated I, thou experience too belongs with the metaphysical sphere of subjectivity. Now, the celebrated I, thou, what does he mean by this? He means Martin Buber. And I'll try and say something more about this in classes to come, but just while I'm here, in case I forget, I and thou. Jewish philosopher. And he wants to distinguish types of language. And he wants to distinguish human beings from other forms of being. There's a difference between a person and a thing. A thing is an it. A thing is third person. People are first person or second person. There's an I and a thou. When God speaks to us, he speaks to us as persons. Buber is reintroducing the idea of personhood as important, an important thing in the discussion, which it is. Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, very important. In a sense, a dissident voice in the whole conversation from the Romantic period onward is to say, actually, it's not all rooted in nature in the sense of feeling as the fundamental ground between all forms of life, animal and vegetable, and maybe even mineral, which we share in common. It's something distinctive about human nature, and it's that when we speak to other people, use that form of language, we assume an understanding object on the other side. Animals don't understand when we speak to them. There's a disclosure of the being of the person of the person in language. So he's talking about that, Buber here, and Buber is a very important, I would say peripheral for the purposes of 20th century thinking, but from a Christian point of view, I think important. That there are types of I, thou. Now note this, and this is again a digression because I'm digressing from the digressions of the digressions at this point. When gender theorists talk about language, they want you to identify their pronouns, but they always want you to identify your pronoun in terms of the third person. What's my pronoun? I am my pronoun. That's a pronoun. Why can't I use I? Oh, for you, you can call me you. Second person. I'm going to put that, I mean, if I were more of a controversialist than I am, and I'm controversial enough, I would just say my pronoun is I, but you can call me you. Just for you, you can call me you, and everybody can call me you. And guess what? You have the exact same pronouns, but if you want to present your difference from the rest of us, sure, you can talk about yourself in abstraction from a distance, look upon yourself as if you were outside of yourself, and you can call me by a third person, which is what somebody from a distance, that's him or her or it. Sure, that's from the outside. But as a personal pronoun, I do not refer myself as a third person, ever, let alone a plural. I can't be they. Because I'm a singularity. Anyway, it's just language confusion again. But why would that take place there? Again, call me by this pronoun. Because all of the words, irrespective of what they are, have no essential basis in reality at all. They're expressions of feeling. And I feel like I want to identify with the third person as if I'm objectified, distance from myself. It's already an alienating form of thought. I don't use the pronouns myself because I think that they alienate people from themselves, even though when they invite me to speak of them in that term, I think it's infinitely problematic for the person. It in a sense, supports their confusion about themselves, and it destroys any notion of common human nature, which the language and the grammar of the language would have held on to. Everyone in this room is a you. They can speak of themselves as an I. They can be spoke of in the third person. Okay, you may not like that, but where's the commonality? It's in the I and the you, first person, second person. And guess what? The I and thou is the most important aspect of us, not the gender. Everyone who is an I and a thou has a gender, because all human beings have a sexual differentiation, either male or female, but each of those male and females is still an I and a thou. Important point, I never hear anybody talking about this. But anyway, the celebrated thou belongs with the metaphysical sphere of subjectivity, and I think this is so wrong. It's absurd. It's not subjective. I and thou are not subjective. But that's Heidegger's take on Buber. Buber disagrees strongly with Heidegger on this. Here, clear breach. But we know, or let me continue on because I keep digressing, or by now ought to know that Hermes was never simply our friendly postman, but the granddaddy of tricksters, a figure of anarchy or misrule, or thievery, treachery, and deceit, someone always a little out of control, the bringer of truth who doubles as the thief of reason, and who therefore leaves you in perpetual hesitation as to what you have just heard or said, written or read, a little like Puck. In short, a polytropic figure, someone mischievous and untrustworthy, like the language we speak when we try to make sense of anything. So Hermes is now not the message bearer who is faithful to the one who sent the message. He is somebody that is a little mischievous and is going to wreck or mess around with the intentions of the sender. To get the intentions of the sender, we have to go back to the origin point. But the language, the means of transmission, is problematic, and infinitely problematic for that matter. So this is a different form of hermeneutics. It's a great illustration, by the way, of the two paths of hermeneutics. There's the one where he's the clean-cut boy with wearing the uniform, and which he delivers on time, unlike the postal service of today, immediately, and you clearly understand everything that's being said by the original sender. He's the opposite of that. He gets the mail lost, he reformulates it, he puts it in different terms, and you have no idea what the original sender was trying to say to you. This is not Hermes the friendly postman, but Hermes the many-sided, uncontainable, nocturnal transgressor, who among other things fathered Pan upon a faithless Penelope, and then taught the goat boy how to masturbate. Okay, so this is a reference to a myth of where Pan came from. Pan is the reference to nature. Now this could become really interesting at this point, but this is where Pan comes from, by the way. It's from Hermes. And is it Odysseus' Penelope? Yes, it is. Faithful Penelope. There's a myth that goes along with this that actually she wasn't always faithful, but that's because she got tricked. Hermes disguised himself and fooled her. And they had a child. His name was Pan. Now this is, again, poetic use of mythology that's leaning into, and I think against, the tradition of the Greeks as the upholding virtue as a universal. And I think that's what the Odyssey teaches. It teaches virtue. But if that faithful Penelope is undermined, and there's a dissenting tradition there, and that's what is in this myth, and it goes down the Ovidian metamorphosis type thing, then we have the rule of chaos and anarchy everywhere, rather than the conveyance of truth and goodness and beauty and justice and virtue, etc., in the tradition. So it's a marginal. So the question is whether Heidegger's reading of this is universally true of human nature. And the postmodernists following Heidegger say it is. It's just, there's no escaping this problem. Comments or questions thus far? I've got a few minutes left here, and I'm going to carry on, but I went far too far already without asking you. Okay, I'll carry on. So there is, of course, an obvious or trivial sense in which repetition, now this is interesting, note this word repetition. What comes to mind here in this class? Repetition for understanding.
Coleridge's primary imagination?
Yes, but what's he referring to when he talks about repetition? What's the word that was used before this in the tradition?
Oh, mimesis?
Yes. Mimesis is just repetition, but you have to, in order to repeat it, you have to be able to repeat it and understand it. It's not just verbal repetition. Like, I can speak a foreign language by repetition. I can't understand it, but I can verbalize it. I can make those noises that make it sound like I know what that word means, but I don't. And what Heidegger is effectively saying is, yes, we do it without understanding. To get the understanding, we actually have to get inside the mind, and we can never do that because language is the house of being, and language is the impediment. It's the instrument, but it's also an instrument that never leads us to understanding things exactly. So he says, there is, of course, an obvious or trivial sense in which repetition is foundational for understanding, and so for hermeneutics, namely that without repetition, we would never be familiar with anything. There would only be unrelenting strangeness or aphasia. That's the current intellectual scene, by the way. Not only what I've talked about before, which is the desire to forget the past, as if you were struck on the head and suffered from amnesia, but that, in fact, there's an aphasia, which is only held together by a stronger and stronger intervention from the state to hold things together. The state's, by the way, response to its own growth and power is to want more, but to accelerate the problem of understanding between people. It doesn't serve the people anymore, it serves itself. But anyway, problems start, and now he's summarizing, when philosophers begin to worrying the distinction between identity and difference, sameness and otherness, and then imagine a world divided between those who come down on the side of sameness, who desire familiarity and cultivate nostalgia, and those who seek emancipation from this state of affairs, who want to get us beyond the pleasure principle and to face reality, horrible as it may be. The radicals and the reactionaries, hermeneutics is just a philosophy of repetition. Okay, but he wants to save it. So now he gets into Caputo in there. So, but you've got the two camps, and that the purpose of this lecture is not to solve the problem. He wants to suggest Caputo's solution to the problem here. I don't think Caputo's solution to the problem is a solution, neither does he. The purpose of this lecture is just to demonstrate, to show that the radical turn takes place rooted in the problem we had back in the beginning in the 18th century. You're not going to find this in, or I have not read this from anyone else. This is my own understanding. As such, it is questionable. But I'm making the case for it. And one of the caveats, and I really like this here, and this is what I really like about Bruns, it's too much to say that the postal service theory gives us only possible sense that hermeneutics can have. It is too much, but it's not too much if you start in the 18th century. Then it is. The 18th century assumes universal reasoning from universal nature. It simply does. But there is another way of looking at it. And the other way is looking at, earlier discussion of tradition describing the sort of hermeneutical scene in terms of a basic opposition between two categories or genres of discourse, allegory and satire. So in interpretation, historically, not hermeneutics but interpretatio, we see that there's a tendency to allegorize language and understand it. So the biblical text will be allegorized in the Christian tradition. That's another way of doing this. And that goes back all the way to antiquity, a tendency to allegorize texts. But the modern idea of interpretation, and this is why Bruns situates modernity in Luther, and I said at the time when I taught this that he was accusing Luther of being the origin of this problem, and I am saying it's not Luther, it's the 18th century theories of language. There's the differentiation there. But Luther saw that as an antagonist of allegorization, that the text always interprets itself. Scriptura sui ipsius interpres, meaning we don't have control of the text. Scripture interprets Scripture. The Word of God, the Word always, or the Spirit always rules over the text. Not the church, not the reader, but God Himself interprets Scripture. When it's interpreted faithfully, it's God Himself doing the interpretation. And He's doing so not allegorically by analogy, but directly. The Holy Spirit is present and makes real in the minds of the reader what God intends there. So it's what I called a pneumatic, or what he called a pneumatic understanding of the text. From pneuma in Greek, which is spiritual. Now, the difference then is between the Holy Spirit, which is what Luther means, and the spiritual, which is what Hegel means. Is there a difference between the pneumatic reading of Luther's understanding of the text and Hegel's understanding of Pneuma as human spirit? And I would say yes, it's the difference between the Holy Spirit and the human spirit. And just because they're both Geist doesn't mean that the difference between them, one's the Heiligen Geist and the other is as in the Holy Spirit and the other is just the Spirit. There's no distinction between them. There's a categorical distinction between the Spirit of God and the Spirit of man. And the Spirit of God has the capacity for revealing in truthful ways, whereas the Spirit of man is prone to error, marked by sin, guilty of misinterpreting, misrepresenting, etc. So there's a different thing going on there. So Luther's shift towards Scripture interpreting Scripture, I think this goes back to a debate earlier in the church between schools of interpretation between Antioch and Alexandria. The Antiochian school is the grammatical, historical reading, and the Antiochian is more the allegorical. They try and break that down that way. So I would take issue with the way in which Bruns formulates this. However, his point is well taken, that there is more than one way of understanding hermeneutics than as just the messenger without any problems. There's always been problems in the text. And that's why we have allegorical readings. Because it can't mean what it says here. Or there's a richness, a plenitude of meaning in the text that is not exhausted in a simple literal reading. And Augustine's On Christian Doctrine waded into that and got down into the deep weeds furthermore. I think it's very profound what he says there. But anyway, I think I'm done for today because I've said more than enough, actually. Probably too much, but